is, it doesn't matter whether it's your field or not. Ask away. Thanks, over to you.
Thank you. I attended the last talk. I think it was the last talk, John Parkington's talk last month, and John mentioned in his presentation that he actually, despite his current South African residence, he actually comes from Manchester. He's an old Manchester boy. And Martin doesn't know this about me, but my great-grandmother is actually buried, because of a series of historical accidents, she's buried in Moston. So I actually think that this is Martin's subtle way of demonstrating that all paths lead to Manchester inevitably. Right, so today, I like to think of archaeology as telling a story, because we interpret the past, and there's sort of an infinite number of ways that we can interpret the past. So I'm going to try to tell a story today, and I'm going to try to tell a story that has to do with an examination of power relations. In the social sciences, when we think about issues of power relations, power dynamics, we recognize that it's a constructed relationship, that power is enacted through social interactions. It's not something that somebody possesses and somebody else doesn't possess, right? It's a fluid social relationship. It's multiple in its form, and it's quite situational. The particular way power expresses itself depends on its social context, its wider social context. So ultimately, as the sociologist Anthony Giddens sort of famously observed, all social actors, no matter how lowly they are, will have some degree of penetration of the social forms that oppress them. So in other words, power consists of sort of two different vectors: domination, power over people, but also insubordination. All people have the ability to choose to not do something they're being told to do. Now, this is important when you think about how these sort of different forces relate to each other materially. And really, there's two different models that sociologists have come up with for describing the dynamics of power. The first is an oppositional approach. A number of archaeologists, people like Bruce Trigger, Mike Rowlands, Danny Miller, they've adopted this kind of Foucauldian approach where power is understood as forces of domination, which are locked into a struggle with forces of resistance. And here, domination is the conservative group, and they're interested in maintaining a societal status quo. They're trying to create a world that serves their material interests. And then conversely, resistance encompasses those sorts of behaviors that somehow, contest or limit or frustrate, deconstruct, or in some cases transform this dominant social order, right? But the problem with this model is that it's very binary. It's one or the other, right? And they're locked in this kind of toing and froing, right? Now, it's kind of reductionist. All social behavior then becomes about whether you're, on top or below in this whole binary, right? This binary struggle. So as a result, I got kind of frustrated with that sort of binary. And I became a lot more interested in looking at questions of reciprocity. It's another form of a power relationship. And since the 1950s, there's been this extensive body of work in criminology and penal studies that looks at the sort of dangers of bullying, of self-harming, of violence, suicide that accompanies life in places of incarceration. Prisons are horrible places, and people internalize that when they're there. They're very scary places. So most inmates in carceral environments accept that everyday survival, or as it's called in some criminology literature, the process of making do, requires some kind of sociality. You need to have friends. You need social, emotional, material support to cope inside places of incarceration. And to cope, to get that support, you have to trade. You have to engage in exchange. So, as classically observed by Marcel Mauss, a turn-of-century sociologist, he argues there's no such thing as a free gift. in all non-monetary economies, the exchange of objects immediately generates a series of obligations. They're legal, they're moral, they're social, and indeed, I will argue in this lecture, they're sexual. So trade, this process of reciprocity, it consists of three obligations ultimately. There's the obligation to give, the act of making the gift, right? There's the obligation to receive the gift, because you can always reject something, right? So you have to act receiving it. And then, after an appropriate amount of time, you have to reciprocate or countergift. Now, exchange becomes a cycle of obligations because, of course, the countergift itself becomes a gift, so then the obligation is traded back to the other partner. So it's this kind of web or network of obligations that gets created through this process of gifting, receiving, and countergifting. Now, it becomes a really Baroque network of favors, obligations, threats, promises, and ultimately it becomes this very pluralized, very transient kind of form of power, as everybody owes something to everybody else in these systems. So instead of a binary form of power with, some people resisting and others dominating, instead what you get is a hierarchical web of power. So it's a much more diverse way of thinking about power relations, with power being bartered and negotiated and transformed in this sort of very fluid, very constantly becoming process. So I think that this type of web or network, this hierarchical mode of power is how I think it's the most appropriate way of interpreting convict power relations, and particularly in these British penal colonies of 19th century Australia. So when I think about resistance, and I'm going to talk about these sort of resistant activities here, I'm not thinking about large-scale open rebellions, right? These are prisoners. They've been already convicted of crimes, transported to the other side of the planet, and they live in penal institutions, right? So you're not going to have giant, large-scale open rebellions. Instead, insubordination appears as these small, everyday, active, opportunistic little actions. What Eric Hobsbawm has called working the system to their minimum disadvantage. They're never going to overthrow it, but they can kind of hustle it a bit so it works to their best benefit. So I'm interested in looking at how we can think about small patterns, small everyday moments of non-compliance, of vandalism, petty insubordination, of gender trouble, of sexual activity, and ultimately black market exchange. To think about the material, the archaeological signature of these kind of everyday power relations inside a particular historic site. Now, this is just a little slide so we know where we are in the world. This became more relevant when I was teaching in America. My students sometimes had trouble working out the difference between Austria and Australia. So I learned very quickly Tasmania, Tanzania, totally different places. So I became very good at pointing out where we are in the world so we're all in the same place. We're not in Africa. So Tasmania is an island. It's off the south coast of Australia, right below Malvern. And if you've never visited, it's a wonderful place. I feel like I work for the Tasmanian Tourist Board sometimes. It's a really, really beautiful landscape there. And Tasmania was established in 1803. The first penal colony was established, Botany Bay, or modern-day Sydney, Port Jackson, was located sort of up the coast there where it says sort of, well, it says Newcastle, and then right below that it says Botany Bay in Sydney. That was 1788. It's a direct result of the American Revolution. Britain could no longer ship penal transported felons to the American colonies. They used to send them to Maryland, Virginia, and Georgia. The American Revolution, they couldn't anymore. So, and they were also worried about the French who were sniffing around the area. There was a very lucrative South Pacific trade. So they thought, well, we'll set up a permanent colony. We'll dump our convicts down there. So 1788, you get the first penal colony in Sydney. By 1803, the French are starting to sail little loops around Tasmania, looking for whales. They get nervous. They think, aha, we need a second penal colony. So 1803, they sail up to Hobart Town and set up a second penal colony. Now, I'm specifically looking at female convict prisons. Over the 70-year period of the Australian penal transportation era, about 170,000 men and women were transported. This is one of the largest involuntary migrations of Western people in modern history. It's a tremendous number of people. There's also an unknown number of children because, of course, these women convicts would give birth on board. Their children were always counted if they accompanied them. You also get a lot of questionable parentage going on inside the colonies. So there's an unknown number of children who also get kind of brought along in the system. So in terms of the female convicts, they tend to be accommodated in what are called female factories. This is a shortening of the word manufactory because it's based on the English workhouse system. It's not factory in the sense of like, industrialized production. Although they do engage in labor, which I'll talk about briefly in this talk. So there are three that operate at its peak period in the 1840s. I'll just jump up for a second here. The first one is outside of Hobart Town, the colonial capital. It's the Cascade Female Factory. That's 1828 that's established. And then Launceston, which is up the top at the end of the Tamar River. You'll recognize some of these names. It's a completely colonial landscape. At the mouth of Tamar, you have Launceston, the second female factory, that was 1832, and then the one that I've worked on, I've excavated, is the Ross Female Factory. They wanted to open up female labor to the Midlands sort of pastoral agrarian area. They wanted women to ideally work as domestic servants in some of these old properties. So they opened the Ross Female Factory, which is located right under the N of land along that main road. So it's a rural, bucolic kind of factory in its ideal kind of plan or intention. It's now managed by the Parks and Wildlife Service as a historic site. And it's a funny place because the amount of recycling was never substantially reoccupied after the convict period. And it's on the edge of a rural town, so there was never any development pressure. So most of the standing structures have been recycled and rebuilt into other, buildings around the town. However, so it looks like a giant sheep paddock when you look at it. It's a relatively unimpressive place. However, remove 10 centimeters of soil, and all the original foundations, muster yards, everything are right there, preserved perfectly under the soil. So in that sense, it is of tremendous international value as a women's prison because all of these layers are kept intact, even though it just looks like a paddock to the non-archaeological eyes. Let's see. Oh yeah, by way of just a small observation here. The state changed its name to Tasmania in 1855 after the end of the convict transportation period, and it was to avoid this sort of convict stain. So Van Diemen's Land is Tasmania, and it was literally because they wanted to cleanse themselves. They renamed the island and then created this whole new mythology of origins around being a sort of cowboy pioneer state instead of a prison, a colonial prison. Now, over its peak of operation, it was founded in 1848, and it operated as a prison until 1854, when they stopped sending convicts across to the colony. And a lot of my historic research has indicated that its peak in 1850, the site accommodated approximately 180 female inmates and about 40 of their children, who were all under the age of 3. At the age of 3, they were declared orphans and then moved off to the Royal Orphan Institute, which was in the colonial capital. This was seen as good for the children because it would remove them from the stain of their mothers. So there's this whole interesting kind of critique of parenting and the ability to mother that's going on in these institutions. Now, this is a map of the site. This was done after the convict period when there were some discussions about maybe turning it into a boys' reformatory. Never happened, but the map is great because it shows, the plan shows us what the prison looked like during its peak of operation. Now, inside this prison, the women are divided into 3 institutional classifications. You have, let's see if I can get that, yeah, here's a little arrow. This is the crime class ward. Here, these women are under 24-hour lockdown inside the prison. And remember this little porch feature because it'll appear again in a slightly different form. Here's the entrance to the prison. Now this place, it's really interesting. It's almost like this physical topography of guilt and redemption that's built into this landscape. When you enter the prison through its entrance here, you're actually descending down into the main compound of the prison. There's a drop of a couple meters in this sort of entranceway. So you're descending down from, the free community down into this prison where, of course, you'd be issued a uniform, your personal possessions would be taken away, your hair would be cut, and, you would enter into the crime class. During the crime class, while you're there, you're sleeping in hammocks, 2 to a hammock in this ward, and in this ward, here's the muster yards where they were collected every day and counted out. During the day, when they were put to work, they'd be marched out across the factory, interestingly past the nursery wards here, so they get no access to their children, but they can hear them. They're separated by a whole series of fences and walls from these nursery wards. They're marched out here into the workrooms where they're counted in, they're given their equipment, and then they're put to work at spinning, at laundry. There's laundry tubs over in this area here, and literally making uniforms. While they're here in the workrooms, this is a whole series of windows. So as they're laboring away, what they're looking at is a combination, their vista is the church, this little neo-Gothic church number here, and a bank of solitary cells. So literally, salvation or damnation is facing them as they're working away, making their uniforms. At the end of the day, they'd be marched up into the chapel. They'd have to do their prayers. They'd be marched back in and fed again and marched up here and put to bed for the night after an hour and a half of a combination of religious education and also literacy training, because you want your domestic workers to be able to read shopping lists, so you need them to read. So they were taught with numeracy and rudimentary reading. Obviously, if they deviated from this plan, they were dumped down into the punishment class, where they would be separated from the main community, marched down the hill again off to these solitary cells where they could spend up to 3 weeks, supposedly on a bread and water diet. But we'll look at the material evidence around that. Then, after they had sort of, served their time in the prison, done their 3-year sentence, didn't get pregnant, they would be promoted up to the hiring class, which is this part of the prison. So already there's this kind of, down into the prison, then down into these solitary cells, up again to the main compound of the prison, and then when they go out to work in the free community as government workers, they then go up the hill again and leave the prison. So it's almost this cyclical kind of movement down and then back up again as they're allowed to be cleansed and sort of rejoining the free community. This is, I like to think of this as my Berkeley tie-dye picture here. It's a digital elevation, it's a topographic modeling, and it's just to show here, this is high elevation is the greens, this is that entranceway. And you can see really it's a drop of elevation of a good couple meters down. This is the main compound of the prison, and it's literally cut back into this river sort of valley side. Here, this is this elevated neo-Gothic church, and then the solitary cells are off down here in the lowest part of the site. So it's just a little model to kind of show that graphically. This is a topographic map that we created to mark our excavation areas during the project. And area A here was over this crime class, because my initial research questions were looking at what is the material culture associated with these different states of promotion or demotion inside the prison. And of course I went into this thinking, well, the highest amount of kind of illicit, behavior, right, the biggest evidence is probably going to be in the crime class, because they're the new fresh ones who've come in. They haven't been broken yet, right? And then probably, the hiring class are going to be the good girls, so there's going to be very little stuff there. And then solitary is going to be really barren because they're on this, bread and water diet. So we excavated in 1997, 96 and 97, we excavated here in the crime class. Over here in the hiring class is area B. Down here in the solitary cells, this is that neo-Gothic church right there. Here's our solitary cells. That's area C. Area D was just this natural pit I dug just to get a sense of what the ordinary soil profile was in the area. And then in 2007, we got some funding to come back and investigate the nursery ward. So that was area E there. So that's our 2007 season. This is what the site looks like. This was, yeah, this was New Year's Eve. This is what archaeologists do for a good time on New Year's Eve. This is the middle of summer, and it was like the wettest summer they'd ever had. And we ended up having to build this little tent over our excavation trench in the crime class ward because it rained so much. And the sheep, see, the river broke its banks like on New Year's Day. So I spent New Year's Day out there bailing my trench out from frozen water, and all the sheep had come and fallen into the trench because the river had broken its banks, and it was all flooding in the area. So we're shoving sheep out of this trench. It was very exciting. But here's our big paddock. This is that entrance way where I said with that big drop. Here's the main compound of the prison. So the crime class over here, hiring class is just off to the side there. This is some of the Park Service interpretation signs that they put in so that visitors knew what they were looking at in this open field. The nursery ward is this depression around here. This is the Neo-Gothic church, little chapel there. And then the solitary cells are down here where all the sheep seem to be collecting. That bump there. We had, effectively it's sort of three very concentrated seasons. We had about 80 different volunteers made up of students from Australian universities, also a lot of community volunteers, a lot of convict descendants. People love genealogy in Australia, and so coming and volunteering for the project is part of them kind of uncovering their own heritage and history. So we'd get some wonderful stories from people who just come and visit or come and participate in the project, which is great fun. And then we also had Aboriginal training, Aboriginal heritage officers who came to kind of learn more about the process of excavation. So here's Charlie and Vernon from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Land Council who are doing some wet sieving for me to make sure we got all of the Aboriginal flakes out of the site, the lithics. It's not an Aboriginal site, but what was really interesting, because it's double sandstone with kind of a rubble infill, really common kind of English stone architectural style. When these convict builders, when the guys got down there and put together the site, instead of breaking up new stone to build into their walls, they saw these little patches of very nicely flaked stone. So they scooped them up and built them straight into the walls. So when I excavate the site that's been demolished, we're finding Aboriginal artifacts that originally were part of this sort of architecture of the site, and sometimes we even find them with bits of mortar kind of still attached onto them. So it was a kind of interesting project. I did a lot of liaising with the Aboriginal Land Council because the legislation at the time kind of arbitrarily separated the landscape into Aboriginal sites, and you get one type of permit, or historic sites, you get a different type of permit, right? Suddenly I had Aboriginal materials in a historic site. Nobody had the proper kind of permit to work out about how I could legally do this work. So I was technically in breach of the law there for about 6 months while they worked out what permit they could backdate to cover me. So it was great that I could work with the heritage officers and sort of, they've since changed a lot of their heritage policy in the state. So it was kind of an exciting time to be there. So here's just to show that archaeologists dig holes, really. Here's my trench shots. This is that entranceway there into the crime class. Here's the pebble-packed original muster yards here. This giant stone here is a cap on this barrel drain system. Remember I said it floods a lot in the area, so you have this extensive drain system to get water off the site and down into the fields below. This is the interior, exterior wall, interior wall. This wall here would have been a joist support for floorboards. They installed floorboards and ceilings when, right before they moved the women and children into the site. Archaeologically, this is really exciting because it means that the material that falls below the floorboards dates to the female convict period. So we have this perfect cache of material, right, that I could definitely say this belonged to the female convict period because those floorboards were put in for the female convicts. So that's what makes this site so unique. You know, most institutions, right, are used for a number of different purposes, where they have sandstone floors, so you're not going to get a lot of stuff. Whereas here we had this perfect sort of, 10-centimeter space that all this stuff had fallen down into that we were able to then excavate out. So it's a really exciting site archaeologically. This is the hiring class, assistant superintendent's sort of offices here. This is what these underbarrel sort of drain system looks like here. We found all kinds of really just odd things that had kind of been pushed down drains or hidden in drains. There was some very large flagged sort of sandstone pathway here, which I'll come back to towards the end of the talk. But just, we've lifted it up to get down to the underbarrel and found some very interesting artifacts under this sandstone pathway. This is the muster yard. Here, now the muster, this is already a demonstration of power, right? The assistant superintendent's office has a nice sandstone paved pathway leading up to the door. The female convicts have a pebble-packed, dirty muster yard to walk in. And they had a lot of trouble getting small-sized shoes for the women. So I found a letter from the superintendent of this prison to the superintendent of the men's prison where the boots were being made, and he's requesting, he's saying, we really, really need more small-sized boots because these women are getting sick because they're walking around with no shoes on and their feet are always wet. So it's already this kind of, uniform space power relation just being materially communicated in letting these women get sick and walk around barefoot inside the prison. Again, this is the wall of the hiring class, and there would have been floorboards sort of going off to the sides. This is the more recent work we did. In 2007, we opened up the nursery ward, and one of the most exciting artifacts we found there was this, it's a bale seal. Now, bale seals, archaeologists can be complete artifact dorks, really. We're like the nerds of the research world. Bale seals are a way that, when you have bolts of cloth and you don't want people to rip off bits of the cloth as it's being shipped, what they did, and this is from like medieval period, up until the end of the 19th century, the way they marked a full bale of cloth was to, roll it up into one giant bale and then get a big strap, lead strap around it, contain it, and then they'd stamp one of these bale seals through the cloth and through the lead, right? So it's sealed off, so that when it gets popped open, it's known. You can see if it's been tampered with, right? So we found one of these seals. Now, the exciting thing about the seal here, it's got this insignia on it here. One of my volunteers realized that that insignia matches almost perfectly with Her Majesty's Royal Army Ordnance Corps, the commissariat store, their main sort of provisioning store in the main town that this factory is part of, right? There it is in sandstone, carved on, the old historic commissariat store. Now, the Royal Army Ordnance Corps is that branch of the army that was charged with provisioning the imperial prisons in this penal colony. Now, I started to think about this, right? Female convicts were in charge of making the uniforms for the convict system. And a lot of the components of their uniforms, some of it was made of wool, but a lot of it is made of cotton and muslin and calico and flannel. When you think about, now if it's cotton, this is, if this, bolt of cloth is actually a cotton-based material, we're actually looking at a very exciting material statement of globalization, because cotton at that time, for the British Army to be purchasing it in bulk to bring it down to the penal colonies, this is before 1860. It's cotton that would have been grown by African Americans in the American South. And it would have been shipped to where in the world is the cotton textile capital of the 19th century, Greater Manchester. So we're looking at material that's been shipped to Manchester, turned into cheap broadcloth, bought in consignment by Her Majesty's Royal Army, and then shipped to the other side of the planet, where the failed workers, the convicts, right, are then sitting, laboring, stitching it into convict uniforms. So you're looking at this kind of weird globalization of commodities, but you're also looking at the globalization of unfree labor, forms of unfree labor that characterize the Victorian era, from slavery to underpaid workers here to imperial convicts. So it's a really interesting kind of triangle of labor just in that one artifact. So moving to another part of the site, here's the solitary cells. They were horrible places. They're approximately 2 feet wide by about 4 feet long. So to lie down, you'd have to sort of lie down, diagonal across them. They're also, importantly, they're earthen floored. They're not sandstone floored. And I'll talk about the archaeology of why, but they're purpose-built for the female convicts, and they're added to the compound in 1851 after a series of scandals. The superintendent, Dr. Irvine, is investigated for pillaging supplies of porter. And so he turns around and accuses all of the crime class convicts of rampant lesbianism. I'll talk about some of his reports because they're very interesting. But he says, there's rampant lesbian in the crime class. I suspect he's trying to divert a little attention from the fact that he's drunk on the job. But they appear to be unoccupied from about 1851 until about when they shut down the prison in the 1854. Now, here's where archaeology becomes a story. So when we excavate, right, you're peeling back the different layers. So when we're excavating the site here, and this is a side wall of, actually I'll show you. What I'm showing you is a picture of this wall of the trench here, right? So this wall is there. So we pull off the A horizon, the organic layer, right? And I'm thinking it's going to be a really shallow, small, little tiny site, right? And of course, you always open the most exciting thing at the end of the dig when you have the least time, so it's always a huge panic as you're trying to work out what's going on, right? So pull that out, right? No problem. Then we come on a demolition layer, this sort of funny orangey kind of chunky one. That's all the demolition, right? And we're getting 19th century artifacts. So far, so good. Lots of demolition. And also this wood that looks like it's been exposed to great heat. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there's been a forest fire through here or something. Whatever, right? Site's burned. No big deal. So we dig down, and we come down on this packed earth floor here, this kind of orangey one, right? And it looks like a packed earth floor. 19th century artifacts. You know, we're getting all kinds of stuff. I'm thinking, great, we finally hit the floor. Thank God, okay, we're coming down to the last days. You know, I've got to get the site backfilled. I have to have everyone fed. We have to move out of here. We can pull it out, and we come down on another floor. There's a second floor below the first floor. Why does this place have two floors? That's really weird. Again, 19th century artifacts, and I'm starting to think, is this site ever going to end? So we pull out the second floor, and then we come down onto this sort of sterile layer here. So it's no more artifacts. So finally, we've come to the end of it. But we're down a good, meter. We're talking about a good 3-4 feet down of, layering of soil. Now, the clue as to why there were these two floors I found in the central cell that we excavated. This sandwiched between the two floors. So here's that upper sort of orangey hard clay floor. Here's that lower silty dark floor. Two floors. In between, sandwiched between, is what looks like a giant hearth midden. It's like, 60% charcoal. It's just this big, giant, burnt blotch, right, that's sandwiched between the two floors. It's concentrated in southern half of the cell, and as you can see from these profiles here, it kind of connects from there to there. So it was this giant kind of fanned out dump of charcoal in this, central cell. Looked like a hearth. Something had burned. This is a way that archaeologists demonstrate these layers of soil, so it's kind of a schematic, right? So what we're looking at here, what I think we're looking at is the possibility that there's a burning event that's happened, right? Because we've got the building here, then we've got this first floor, right? And then we get this burning fire event, and we're finding all this charcoal and wood that seems to have collapsed down from the ceiling. So this solitary cell appears to have been partially destroyed. It's been burnt down and smashed in. And then you have the superintendent obviously repairs your solitary cells and puts in the second floor on top. So what we're looking, if I go back to that reciprocity model, what we're looking at is this kind of action-reaction, dynamic going on. The convicts don't like being, well, first of all, there's all this kind of, rampant lesbianism supposedly going on. There's all this, activity, illicit activity going on. He is fired. They get the new superintendent. He builds new solitary cells. That's a statement of, domination over a prison population. The women obviously, keep engaging in their activities, right? And something happens where they actually set fire to the place, partially damage it, destroy it. Which is a statement of their upper hand. They've traded back the upper hand, right? But then, of course, the institution doesn't accept that as an endpoint. They react by, rebuilding the cells again, And then what we found was, even in that upper floor, in the west cell, we found a little cache. Somebody had dug a hole into and then stuck illicit artifacts down into there. So we have a little stash of more illicit artifacts. So even rebuilding the cell, it changes, their expression of power. It doesn't stop it. So we still have, all of these illicit materials starting to show up on these floors. We get alcohol bottles, we get tobacco pipes, and we get lots and lots and lots of uniform buttons. So there's this obvious trading of materials down to that part of the prison that's supposed to be, the greatest surveillance, the greatest discipline, bread and water diets. Now, I'm kind of interested in, if we think about the idea of a big prison fire, it's a spectacular event, right? You're going to have, the prison burning, you're going to have people running around, screaming, yelling, hysterics, right? It's going to be a big moment. So it's interesting that the medium of the resistance is sensual, it's very embodied, right? You're going to have, people, using their clothes to burn down. There's some evidence from other sites where the women would frequently tear off their uniforms and set fire to their uniforms and shove them through ventilators, to set fire to some of these prison structures. It was a common way that these convict women sort of demonstrated. So you have, also the spectacle of sort of female nakedness, and they're using, the uniforms as this kind of material of resistance, this medium of disorder. You also get architecture being this medium of resistance, right? They're communicating both power over people, but also resistance to it through the physical, architecture of this site. So ultimately, you're looking at this kind of barter of power through the physical structure of this place. Now, I want to think about what some of these illicits were, these illicit materials that they're exchanging and trading here. Oh, this is just an image of this fabulous stash pit that we found cut down into the upper floor of the prison. The materials we found there, it was interesting. There does seem to be a decrease in the amount of black market activity. When I looked at the number of tobacco pipes and alcohol bottles and compared, that bottom floor, the first floor, to the second floor, I found the bottom floor had about 7 of these pipes and about 6 bottles. As in archaeology, you can get a bottle can smash into an infinite number of pieces, so you have to count bases or count tops to work out how many were there. So we always have a minimum vessel count, so that you don't end up counting thousands of shards of something and overinflating your numbers. So we got a minimum vessel count of about 7 pipes and about 6 bottles in that first floor, whereas in the second floor, the upper one, we found a minimum vessel count of 1 pipe and 2 bottles. So it does look like there's this, again, shifting of power. They're doing less of this black market activity, but it's still present. And then in the stash pit, of course, we find, both a bottle and a pipe sitting down there, as well as some food remains. Now, again, in archaeology, right, how do we know that these alcohol bottles, I mean, they're classic, old, Victorian kind of olive glass, heavy, wine or beer bottles, right? How do you know that they actually held an illicit fluid in them? Because they could have just held water for the supposed bread and water diet. We were lucky enough with in the solitary cells, we got this one artifact that still had some of the residue kind of concreted in it underneath the soil there. You can just make out at the back there, once I had cleaned it, it had this kind of thick, it had been a syrupy sort of material that had concreted, and you can see one of these tobacco pipes is actually stuck inside the concretion there. One of my volunteers, nice teenager from the local high school, his mommy was the head microbiologist at Bogue's Brewery. So I took a little sample of this concreted material and went up and visited her lab, and they all got very excited, and we looked at it under little thin section slides. And unfortunately, they were dead yeast cells. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I'd be sitting on an island off of Greece selling convict beer to Australians. I'd be rich. But no, they were dead yeast cells. But there was a fermented beverage inside this bottle. The presence of the yeast cells meant that there was some fermented beverage that had been held. So they couldn't tell. It was too dead to work out whether it was a wine or a beer. My guess is on the beer, just because the material that kind of got sent down to. This is before the advent of the Australian wine industry, so it's most likely beer. But the fermented beverages were present. Again, how do you know what they're smoking in the tobacco pipes? It was great. If you don't wash them and scrape them out, you could literally smell the tobacco. It was really almost emotive, kind of, to actually smell the past like that was incredible. So yeah, there's tobacco going through those pipes. Now, I want to talk here briefly. Why engage in this exchange? What's going on here, right? How can we socialize this process? If we return back to this classic ethnographic studies, the gift, right? And Marcel Mauss. It's important to remember that it's not just the objects, right, that are entering into this exchange. And Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist, he explicitly, when he was writing about gift exchanges, he really intentionally adopted the term libido to describe the yearnings or cravings that fuel social trade. So within this carceral environment, any resources can serve as valuable commodities. So information, knowledge, messages, even sexual encounters. So a lot of the documentary evidence linked that I looked at around these prisons linked sort of casual sexual activity to the exchange of illicit sorts of objects. Most commonly, in sort of superintendent's reports, it was extra food rations and our two friends, alcohol and tobacco. Now, trafficking, as this sort of black market exchange was called at the time, trafficking provided incarcerated women with these essential resources, diverting luxuries, a way to make the day a bit better while you're stuck in this prison. But more significantly, we can see these objects as materially linking female convict partners, to the male colonists, to their partners outside the prison, and often to their illegitimate children that are also incarcerated with them in the nursery ward. So, for example, there was an intercepted letter that the superintendents found in October 1847. The matron of the Cascade Female Factory found this letter, which was then passed on to the superintendent of convicts. It was written by an inmate, Mary Clark, and I'm going to read a quote from it because it's quite a poignant letter. She writes, "My dear Fred, it is with pleasure I now write these few lines to you with my sincere loving hope that you will not forget to send me 5 shillings, as you know I had none when I was taken, and you know it'll be of use to me in here. You can send this to me by the priest, of all people, and he will bring me anything that you send." Very well. "Dear Fred, I hope you will be steady until I come out, as I intend to keep sober and steady, and if you send in a memorial, you can get me out and go to our child in the orphanage in town. She's in town now. Dear Fred, please send me a letter by Father Wolfrey. I shall expect an answer by next Friday. And dear Fred, I am surprised to think that you should spend your hard-earned money with that other woman who's old enough to be your mother. But I hope, dear Fred, you know better for the future. Do not forget to write me and send me in some money. I now conclude with my love to you." And it was addressed, and didn't get to, a tailor in Hobart, a fellow called Fred Tring, who, of course, was sent to prison for receiving, or for, being asked to send in illicit material. Now, so we can look at these objects not just as, like things that people like inside the prison, but they're also objects that connect people to other people outside the prison walls. We can also look at similar dynamics through same sexual encounters between different inmates. So remember I said that our friend the superintendent accused everybody of lesbianism in the crime class ward. It was this wonderful, it's an 1848 letter he's written to the Controller General of the Convict Department. And he characterizes the English vice, as it was called, the English vice, as it was known in the penal colony. Now he writes, and here I'm quoting from Dr. William Irvine, he writes, "These young girls are in the habit of decorating themselves, cleaning themselves scrupulously, and making themselves as attractive as they can before resorting to the man-woman, if I may so style her, on whom they have bestowed their affections. I believe a large proportion of the quarrels which too frequently occur amongst these women take rise from disagreements concerning the choice of a pseudo-male, or jealous feelings consequent on some of these disgraceful transactions. To my certain knowledge, several disputes have arisen here, and from these causes there have been letters intercepted and shown to you which will prove the warmth and the impetuosity of the feelings excited in the women towards each other when allied in such unholy bonds." Now, in the same letter, he also explains in detail the sort of romantic rituals by which these female convicts woo each other, entice each other's sexual desire. So he writes, "The most passionate appeals are frequently made by the women, as contradistinguished from the pseudo-males, when they have suspected the last-named party of infidelity or fickleness. Indeed, an amount of jealousy seems to be aroused as great as could possibly be if an actual male was in question. Promises and threats are alike lavished on their objects of love, and they are habitually in the practice of making numerous presents to their lovers, so that an individual who acts in the infamous part of a pseudo-male is most comfortably provided for, with the presents bestowed with every procurable luxury." So this is interesting. They're enticing each other through the material world, of these illicit objects, as well as decorating their bodies and cleansing their bodies. So, in certain cases, in other examples, this link between kind of economic exchange and sexual exchange is incredibly blatant. In 1841, inmate Anne Fisher reported on her bunkmates' nocturnal activities to the Colonial Committee of Inquiry into Female Convict Discipline. This was an actual court hearing. So within this her deposition to this committee of inquiry, she claims that at some time after 8 p.m. lockdown in February 1841, this evening in 1841, after the 8 p.m. lockdown, inmate Eliza Taylor visited the hammock that she had to share with inmate Jane Owen. Now, they assumed Anne Fisher, the girl who's telling the story, right, making the deposition, they assumed her to either be complicit or asleep inside the hammock. Although how she could still be asleep after what they do, I don't know. But the two women talked together in an indecent and obscene manner until nearly dawn. Having arranged the terms of what their exchange was going to be, the following evening, Fisher again was awakened when Owen invited Taylor to this shared hammock, and then, and after some time, Taylor asked Owen to give her that which she had asked for the night before. So they negotiate a little bit more, and then Owen says to Taylor that she had never been nailed before. Now, Fisher then handily defines for us what the term nailing means for the gentleman of the inquiry. So she explains to the gentleman of the inquiry that nailing is it's a term for indecently using their hands with the other person's body, or with each other's persons. So indecently using their hands with each other's persons. She notes that Owen made use of her hands on the person of Taylor indecently, and that they behaved in this indecent manner for 4 or 5 minutes. And then after this period, some object was passed to Owen, and Fisher finally left the hammock, calling Taylor a nasty beast. So she'd been hanging out throughout the entire encounter and then decided to leave. So then both, of course, Owen and Taylor are punished for this same blatantly sexual encounter by being sentenced to a period of separate treatment inside the solitary cell block. So this account is highly significant, both because it's a very explicit record of this, sexual economic exchange, but it's also a very unique documentation of contemporary colloquial language for same-sex encounters and sexual activities. It's unusual that you actually get down to what the slang terms are that they're using. Now, I mean, obviously, when we're looking at the expression of women's desire and we're filtering it through institutional judicial gazes here, you can, completely deconstruct that whole process. But we're looking at a basic dynamic of exchange that's going on inside these authoritative narratives. Finally, these buttons that we're finding. Materials are used to entice desire, both as gifts and adornments. So I became really interested in these non-uniform buttons that are showing up in very strange places, like the solitary cells. They're not doing laundry, they're not doing sewing in the solitary cells. So why do we have such a concentration of them down there? In some ways, right, because they're beautifying themselves as part of the act of seduction. So a colleague of mine, Joy DeMusi, has looked at this process of head shaving, which is a disciplinary practice done when the women entered into, as part of dehumanizing them as they enter into the prison. My colleague, Joy DeMusi, has argued that these sort of personal items of adornment were a way of refeminizing themselves, of making them, rehumanizing, but also specifically refeminizing themselves. So she sees it as a resistance display against this process of defeminization that happens in the institution. I'm wondering, returning to this, this motif of reciprocity, if we're also looking at possible trade functions. In Australia, a number of reports on Aboriginal sites talk about the Aboriginal folks in some of the missions using buttons for gambling and playing dice, or using them as gaming tokens. Now, gaming is obviously a form of entertainment, but gaming is also a way of bartering for resources. You're playing a game in order to exchange, to win, to lose, to pass and exchange material. So if you drop out the game part, could the buttons themselves be tokens of value? Similarly, another colleague of mine, Peter McPhee, went through punishment records at one of the young juvenile boys' prisons in the colony, and he found some really interesting punishments. William Bowles, a 15-year-old laborer's boy from the West Indies, was charged with having buttons improperly in his possession and being suspected of gambling. He was sentenced to 5 days solitary confinement on bread and water. Benjamin Stanton was found with buttons in his possessions, but obstinately resisted being searched. And William Cresswell, who arrived in 1835, was charged in August 1836 with strong suspicion of gambling with buttons. So we're getting all of these really decorative, non-uniform buttons showing up in strange places like the solitary cells. We also found, remember I said we were going to talk about that sandstone pathway. Before we lifted it to get to that under-barrel drain, when we lifted it, and these were huge sandstone flags, it took about 4 of us to actually get the thing up and moved out of the trench. When we got this particular large one here, shifted, right about here, in between these two flags, we found a little stash of 15 identical men's trouser buttons been shoved down between these two flags, just right into that little crack. So again, why is somebody stashing these things there? Do they intend to come back for it? Were they prevented from coming back to it? But it's these sort of funny uses of buttons in strange places. We also get examples of like proper coinage. This is a George IV copper farthing from 1823. That was found inside the bottom, one of those bottom floors inside the solitary cells. So you're getting real, colonial coinage showing up, stashed and hidden. And then this is the material from that cache, that a little hole that was dug in the upper floor. And we see here again, what is of value in this kind of a limited environment? What sort of materials are they trading and being resistant with? It's a tobacco pipe, an alcohol bottle, and forget bread and water. Somebody had a nice bit of lamb for dinner that night, because those are little sheep bones there. So ultimately, to kind of by way of conclusion here, as places of ultimate punishment, these solitary cells, on one hand, are architecturally fabricated. They're ideally created to discipline repeat offenders. They're supposed to be the sublime expression of power over the population. They're supposed to break you, right? And they typically house women located at the apex of this underground sexual economy inside the female factories. These sort of weird, sexual encounters inevitably lead to punishment in the solitary cells. But the presence of these tobacco and alcohol related items, as well as this whole act of burning them and crushing, burning it down, and whatever riot was going on with that, all of this indicates a flourishing of illicit trade. Far from being places of punishment, they sound like that's where the party was. Now, during her 1852 deposition to the same Committee of Inquiry into Female Convict Discipline, inmate Mary Hay observed to the fine gentleman, she said, "I've been in the dark cells. That was bad punishment, but even there, tea, sugar, liquor, and baccy can be easily obtained." So, while under solitary sentence, the factory incorrigibles are maintaining their access to these black market activities. On one hand, they're relieving a monotonous boredom, cold, and hunger with a pipe and a bottle. But through their sexual relationships, these female convicts are also equally nurturing romantic commitment and enticing sexual desire through the very materiality of their reciprocal exchanges. Thank you.